Hello students and welcome to today's class. In this class we will be talking about the social stratification which was very prevalent in the ancient Mesopotamian society. There are some objectives of the study, and after studying this we will be able to know main segments of the society and social stratification that was prevalent in ancient Mesopotamian society. We will be able to learn also about main features of family life and property. Then we will be able to distinguish the position of women in different periods of time, and we will be also talking about different fashions and dressing patterns which were prevalent in ancient Mesopotamian society. Now first talking about the house patterns. Houses in ancient Mesopotamia were built of the same materials as those in today's Iraq. The material includes the brick, mud plaster for the walls, mud and poplar for the roofs. Besides, wood was used for doors and door frames which were available nearby in the city. In the 3rd millennium BCE, the standard house was a thick walled mud hut, usually without windows. The windows were prepared from clay and wooden grills set on the walls for aesthetic and strong base. Artificial lighting was done by lamps which were shaped like small shoes filled with sesame seed oil and a wick made from wool or reed. The rooms of these houses showed slight evidence of architectural planning. Doors between rooms were so low that people had to stoop as they went through. Often, two adjacent houses shared a common wall. Under such circumstances, both neighbors were responsible for the upkeep of this wall. Laboratories with a platform above a pit or drain were found from the 3rd millennium BCE onwards and were designed not so often with a seat of bitumen for comfort. The palace of Ishnun, which belongs to around 2300 BCE, had 6 lavatories with raised seats of baked bricks. There were also 5 rooms for bathing purposes also. However, this facility was primarily found in the houses of the elites only. The inventories of bathing room furnishings have provided a list of the commonly used tools such as tubs, stools, jars and mirrors. All lavatories and bathing rooms were connected with the main sewer by drains made of baked bricks. Each bathroom had a large water pitcher. Some of them were found with a pottery dipper to help flush the waste. There was uniformity in the housing patterns. For instance, in the 3rd millennium BCE, the housing pattern in Uruk and Farah covered approximately 400 square meters in surface area. Nevertheless, during the 2nd millennium, the size of the average old Babylonian house at Ur was less than 100 square meters. There is also presence of the house models from different stages in old Mesopotamia. Household furnishings varied according to the time, location and wealth of the owners. The furniture of a typical private house was different from that of the palaces. The furniture was often made from wood and organic materials which decayed over time. Accordingly, archaeological finds of old furniture are very rare, except for places, particularly those like Egypt, where the hot and dry climate prevented this from decay. The furniture designs from the 3rd millennium BCE continued up to the 2nd millennium BCE. Mari texts have provided a comprehensive description of the processes how royal furniture was made. The texts documented use of cords, sinews and glue in building furniture. Leather was also used, but for upholstery. The limited illustrations of beds from the 3rd millennium BCE onward shows the less use of beds. Also, they were often omitted from furniture inventory lists of this period. An old Akkadian source referred to a wooden bed with fruit decoration and slender feet. Nonetheless, by the end of the 3rd millennium BCE onwards, beds were described in texts made from the reed and wood with gold, silver or copper materials. There was presence of beds having legs regularly terminated with an ox hoof. But several beds looked like shallow wooden boxes as well. The household consisted of female and male slaves, but female slaves outnumber the male slaves in Mesopotamian social structure. In a single household, sometimes as many as 10 males and 10 female slaves lived under one roof. There were established rules about the enslaved children who also belonged to their parents' owners. The large estates were divided along with the enslaved people. They were considered part of the property division and were eligible for selling also. Enslavers encouraged enslaved people to marry to raise their wealth. The children of such marriages belonged to the master, who could sell them exclusively. However, separating members of a family was relatively very uncommon. An enslaved person could accept the master's consensus to marry a free woman. Thus, without any dowry, she and her children remained almost free. However, if she got a dowry and financed it with her enslaved husband, who later died or abandoned her, for example, a widow's dowry was then returned back. It was done through a mechanism that half of the profit will be retained by her husband's master. After her owner's death, she and her children were granted complete freedom. If an enslaved woman was purchased by a married woman to act both as her servant and as her husband's concubine, the enslaved person was still considered the property of a wife. The law code provides that the children of this union could inherit from their paternal estate. Now, coming to the family life, the term nuclear family refers to a married couple and their children. In ancient Mesopotamia, the nuclear family was called a house, and a man was forced to build his house. To achieve this goal, marriage was compulsory, and if she was unable to bear children, he could take second wife or a concubine. Also, they could adopt children as well. An extended household denotes a group of people who reside together with one or more relatives along with their children. In ancient Mesopotamia, the extended household includes unmarried sisters, widowed mothers, and underage brothers. This type of extended household was termed as the house of the father. They consider each other as brother, or they used terms like my flesh and blood. In the ancient Near East, the family predominantly was patriarchal. The father was the head of the family who exercised his authority upon all family members. He was the head of the family until his death. In the circumstance of death, the father could offer slaves and any member of his family to his creditor in order to fulfill his obligation. It is noted that the father had the right but not the obligation to redeem them. In case he died untimely and left unmarried children, the eldest son became head of the family and he was to administer the whole estates. Also, if the children are young, then mother was given the authority of fatherhood also. Reconstructing marital relationships in the ancient Near East has proved an arduous task. Usually, marriage was monogamous, even among the gods. Happy marriages thrived in ancient times. The Sumerian proverb mentioned a husband boasting that his wife had borne 8 and was still ready to make love. Like people all over the world, the Mesopotamians too fell deeply in love. Historical sources referred to ensuing depression in case of the rejection of proposal. To cure this, both men and women prayed to the god or even used a magic spell. Certain magic rituals came with a guarantee that if menfolk perform them, the lady will speak to you whenever you meet her. She'll be powerless to resist and you can make love to her. In the case of lovers' disputes, the man might also resort to charm or spells with similar claims. For example, with this claim or with this charm, she will not sleep alone and thus will be loved. The law codes of the contemporary times addressed many aspects of the marriages. Legal documents were drawn to describe property rights of an ancient prenuptial agreement. A typical document from Ur recorded the expenses, gifts and payments which were incurred by the father of the bride in 4 months during the negotiations of his daughter's marriage. There is no doubt that the customs varied over time and place. A simple marriage is generally completed in 4 steps. Number 1, the engagement, payments by the families of the bride, which means dowry, and the groom, which means bride price. The bride is moved to her father-in-law's house, and finally the sexual intercourse. Like other societies, divorce generally was initiated by the husband. The divorce was considered valid only if he returns all possessions taken from his in-laws and sometimes pays a fine also. The divorce was generally followed by the symbolic act of cutting the hem of the wife's robe, that is, reverse of knotting the original bride payment in her robe. The social stigma was attached to divorce because it was not undertaken without any valid reason, such as adultery by wife or wife proved to be barren. The wife in no way was forced to slavery. Likewise, in Mesopotamian social system, if a wife expressed a desire to divorce, she could be thrown out as destitute and naked. The process of the divorce was influenced mostly by whether or not the wife is infertile. However, if woman is sonless, the husband's family did not care if she returned to her father's house or went elsewhere. There are a number of sources which furnish information about beliefs concerning the death and afterlife in ancient Mesopotamia. Many historical sources described their funeral and mourning practices, the cult of the dead, visits from the ghosts, organization of the underworld, and the causes of the death. Most of the literary texts fail in explaining meaning of death and how to deal with fortunes of the dead in the next world. Remarkably, the texts of creation myths generally excluded institution of the death. A Gilgamesh, which is the epic of a hero king, and Atrahasis, which is the Babylonian flood story, both of them they write that the death was created by the god. The goddess resolved overpopulation problem through sterility, miscarriage, and religious celibacy. But death was not considered as the end. The man had a soul or ghost which he innate from the slain god whose body was utilized for creating man. When a man accorded traditional burial rites, he could descend to the kingdom of the dead below the earth, that is, the lowest realm of the cosmos. The Mesopotamians did not speak of death for anxiety, rather, they referred death by using a host of euphemisms akin to cross the Khyber, to go up towards heaven, which meant that only for kings of third dynasty of Ur. Also, they used the terms like to go to one's fate, etc. This Mesopotamian belief was not much different from our own system, because we also use the same terms like we call like passed away. We use the terms like no longer with us, or may he or she rest in peace, and so on. In short, the Mesopotamians also accepted death as an inevitable reality of life. In ancient Mesopotamia, which is same almost today, a person preferred to die in his own bed, surrounded by his own loved ones. The dying person was taken to a superior funerary bed with a chair placed on the left. The soul receives its first funerary offerings on the chair. In order to prepare the dead for burial, a body was first washed and the mouth was tied shut. After this, a corpse was massaged with oil or perfume, clothed in clean garments, and accompanied by his or her personal items as the family could afford. Mostly weapons, toiletries, jewelry, and other objects. They formed the burial objects. The majority of corpses were simply buried, not immortalized. The body and grave goods were laid out for public viewing. A Mesopotamian version of a wake shortly before the funeral. There is no doubt that members of the royal families were anticipated to offer lavish funeral displays. The dead were buried either in a coffin, sarcophagus, or a tomb, but a poor was mostly wrapped in a cloth or reed mat, and with only few pottery vessels, stone beads, a copper pin, or the like. The ruling class and wealthy commoners buried their dead in individual or communal vaulted chambers constructed below the floor of the palace or house. The coffins of kings were time and again impressive. Family members and servants who died at home are buried in the family crypt, and older bodies are pushed aside to make room for new bodies. Many families buried their dead in public cemeteries as well. Those who carried the body to its final resting place are often paid. The edicts of revolutionizing kings, such as those of Uru Inimgina, who ruled sometime 2350 BC, make sure that the amount charged for such services must not be greater. After the burial, mourning rites could last 7 days for the prominent person. In case of death of the king, queens, or queen mother, people mourned in public. Specialized mourners, male and female, they were sometimes hired to increase the number of mourners and lamentations. Sometimes the prostitutes are also recruited for this purpose. The way mourners dressed also communicated their grief. Sometimes they take off their turbans or cover their heads with their clothes and move about unbathed and ungroomed. Fasting was an extra expression of grief. The Mesopotamians accepted men openly, showing their sorrow, but only women tore out their hair or scratched their cheeks and sometimes even their breasts. Once the dead was entered, an official mourning period drew to a close, marked by purification ceremonies and a return to ordinary dress and grooming habits. The ceremonial rites for mourning for Ishtar's spouse, whose name was Dumuzi, as for other dying and returning fertility gods also, they were defined in detail in myths and cult songs meant to accompany the rituals. During the ceremonial mourning for Dumuzi, some vessels used for offerings to the departed were broken. Torches are carried around the funeral bed 3 times, and finally incense was burned. These rites were executed to protect the living from contamination by the dead. niches for funeral lamps, or found in graves at several sites during excavations. Now coming to the subtitle Property and Succession. Each city followed different customs regarding inheritance matters. Generally, the eldest son was favored as number 1, he might receive 2 shares instead of 1. Number 2, he might be assigned more agreed upon proportion of the total estate, at least 10%. And thirdly, he might be allowed to choose his share while the others drew lots. The estate was substantially divided after the father's death so that married brothers could set up independent households. The eldest son may also have inherited father's house because of his duties and other assignments. In some cases, beneath these are housed ancestral remains which are housed in tombs. An old Babylonian document describes the division of the household property in which the eldest son receives a share together with the shrine. Certain inheritance documents inform that the eldest son regularly receives the offering table of the shrine. Houses have separate rooms designed like shrines with baked brick family vault. Though the eldest son usually received more significant share of the inheritance, often real estate was not divided to protect the revenue. In ancient Sumer, the custom was to leave the estate undivided and all became the property of the eldest son, who was designated as heir and leader of the family. The eldest son was obliged to supporting in succeeding his father. All this depicts the eldest son inherited large number of entitlements. For instance, at Nippur, the heir received the temple offices and usually has the first claim on the family property and residential quarters. In later periods, though brothers divided the estates equally, but the eldest son receives a surplus share. In old Babylonian times, the sources reveal how and why the property rights remained within the nuclear family system. When head of the household died, the brothers divided the estates and other resources also. The family members could stay in the house after the father's death. Still, the actual division of the rooms might be postponed and sometimes even until the grandchildren divide it among their families respectively. Mesopotamian inheritance laws time and again results in subdividing a single home into many smaller units. Mud bricks were used to block old doors and new doorways were thrown open when necessary. The head of the household could also present gifts during his lifetime, but they were not included in the property. All this was utilized for daughters whenever they need it in the form of dowry. There was conviction that if the father died before the dowry was arranged, the brothers were advised to allocate part of their estate for their sisters. It is noted in the historical sources that a sonless widow could not inherit from her husband's estates or property. Nevertheless, her husband could make separate arrangements for her during his lifetime. The widow gained access to her dowry once her husband died. If she had no children, her dowry would become the property of her brothers and their descendants. A widow could continue her husband's business by herself, but in case of remarriage, she lost this right because she was no longer considered as part of their family. Contracts from Imar pronounced, a woman who wants to remarry has to perform a symbolic act in the form, which means to place her clothes on a stool, and then she has to left without her possessions. When a woman died, her dowry was inherited by her biological children, both male and female. However, if she has no children at all, her dowry was returned back to the estate of her brothers and their descendants. Now coming to the role of woman in ancient Mesopotamian society. Women's social status was similar to those of men's. However, in legal aspect, women were not equal to men. The position of women was usually higher in the early Sumerian city-states because of the presence of the goddesses in the Sumerian religion. During Sargon's rule, who was the Akkadian king, the Akkadians took part in Sumerian religious observances and rituals. To ensure religious legitimacy, Sargon was the first king in a long list of monarchs to assign his daughter, whose name was Enheduanna, as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur. Enheduanna was a highly accomplished poet. Female scribes are acknowledged as the authors of lullabies for the crown prince, long songs to the king, and even laments. Now coming to the fashions which were prevalent in the ancient Mesopotamian society. The first historical information about clothing and grooming appeared at the end of the 4th millennium BCE in the Mesopotamian world. Clothes were used throughout Western Asia for modesty and protection from heat and cold. The significant sources of about clothing are sculptures, bas-reliefs and cylindral seals. Unfortunately, their colors are no longer visible. Before 3300 BCE, we do not know much about clothing and the development of sculpture and writing. Before the invention of textiles, sheepskins, goatskins and fleeces were probably worn as is portrayed in the Sumerian cultic art. Sheep were sheared or plucked for their wool, and also goat's hair was used for making woolen items. Men wore a belted sheepskin which hung down above the ankles. Women wore a toga-like garment, occasionally secured by a pin from which hung a string of beads or a seal. Male attire underwent a significant transformation in the old Akkadian period. Instead of being nude from the waist up, men started wearing robes that were slung over one shoulder. Robes and men's kilts were made up of draped and pleated material. Woven fabrics in delicate folds with beautifully knotted fringes at the hems and edges took the place of waterproof sheepskins. Both throughout life and even after death, ornamental items composed of jewels and precious metals were used by the women, especially in ancient Mesopotamia. Jewelry was worn by men and women equally. The jewelry decorated the garments of divine images and statues. An artistic representation shows how jewelry was worn at different times. Additionally, Sumerian and Akkadian texts have provided rich information on jewelry and jewelers' workshops. The literary sources, particularly the Sumerian myth of Inanna and Dumuzi, described the goddesses of love preparing for her bridegroom by bathing, perfuming herself, combing her hair, and putting on clothes and even jewelry. Jewelry was given as wedding gifts also between rulers, left as inheritances and included in dowries also. The tablets also mention precious metals taken as booty during military operations. The royal cemetery of Ur is conceivably the most significant repository of knowledge regarding Mesopotamian jewelry. Here, hundreds of burials, mostly dating to the early dynastic period, which sprang from 2900 to 2350 BC almost, were unearthed by Leonard Woolley. A group of 16 tombs contained a great exposition of jewelry, weapons and vessels made of precious metals, musical instruments and other decorative art objects. Some of the most notable objects were the contents of the distributed tomb of Queen Paubi. Next to Paubi's body was a lapis lazuli beaded crown with gold figures of animals, fruits, and flowers. Necklaces made from beads of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and agate are strung in close fitting collar necklaces. Gold, silver, and copper pins with heads of lapis lazuli or carnelian were used to fasten clothing. All of the women at the royal cemetery of Ur wore crescent-shaped earrings. The representational arts indicated an increase in the amount of jewelry worn by both men and women from the Akkadian period, particularly strings of beads and bangles worn at the wrists. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, women wore multi-strung heavy necklaces with long counterweights hanging down their backs to counterbalance the necklace. So this is all what we have to study about the social aspects in the ancient Mesopotamian society. I hope you have understood and enjoyed today's session. Thank you so much.